Last time, we saw the rise of mannerism with its two phases. The first, experimenting with exaggeration, and the second, applying that to mythology and ornamental sophistication. In this chapter, we'll look at broader patterns of patronage at European courts, whether that involves showing off courtly erudition with mythological works, or using art as powerful political propaganda, like in Medici in Florence and Elizabethan England. We'll also look at functions of portraiture in the context of patronage. That will set the stage for the Baroque, the next chapter in European art history. While Florentine mannerists experimented with form and theatricality at the Medici court, northern Italian artists experimented with new genres and perfected old ones. In the 1520s and 30s, Venice remained an extremely capable power on the Italian peninsula, but it was worried about the ramifications and unrest brought about by war. In 1523, the Doge of Venice, Andrea Gritti, signed a peace treaty with the Holy Roman Emperor, proactively avoiding the death and destruction that would plague central and southern Italy when Charles V sacked Rome in 1527. Titian continued to reign supreme as the leading Venetian master, continuing in the high Renaissance style of his Assunta, but becoming increasingly known for painting mythology. And there's no greater early example than his Bacchus and Ariadne, an animated and romantic passage from Roman myth. We see somebody leaping out of a carriage drawn by cheetahs, and the wreath of ivy on his head gives his identity away as Bacchus, the god of wine. His body is curved in this dynamic serpentine form, influenced by Roman sculptures such as the then recently excavated Laocoon group, which proved immediately immensely popular among artists. And behind Bacchus, we see a stumbling parade of satyrs, musicians, drunkards, fellow lovers of wine. Bacchus has thrown his robes into the air. His eyes are fixated on the beautiful and startled figure of Ariadne, a princess who is abandoned on an island. She's rapidly turning around, crying out in surprise. It's said that Bacchus, in his marriage proposal, promised Ariadne immortality and eternalized her presence in a constellation, the Corona Borealis. We can see those stars as a group of 8 glistening points in the heavens, set against a background of royal blue painted using the expensive pigment ultramarine, which is sourced from the rare mineral lapis lazuli, in turn sourced from a single mine in Afghanistan. Titian crowds the right half of the composition, not only to push our eyes leftward, but to provide us candid sense of discovery and of love at first sight. He imbues the picture with the sense of immediacy and animation. Fundamentally, this is a love story, one presented in full and daring color. The work was commissioned by the Este in Ferrara, originally for Raphael, but after he died, it was passed to Titian. And the sensitivity to tone and color here, the highlights among the clouds, the gradations of blue in the sky, it's signature of Venetian colore, of the work of the greatest 16th century colorist. Now, courts all around were competing to commission mythological pictures. It was the new fashionable genre, and so artists had to adapt. The Gonzaga in Mantua, whose Palazzo Te we already saw, partook in this frenzy with a series commissioned from Correggio, who, like his contemporary Parmigianino, hailed from Parma, just next to Mantua. Correggio produced an Leda and the Swan, in which Jupiter, king of the gods, rapes a princess named Leda in one of his many extramarital sexual encounters with both mortals and immortals alike. Now, it's quite a provocative picture, and it's sourced from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is an ancient Roman narrative poem with a half-mythical, half-realistic recounting of the entire history of the world. Many artists took inspiration from this mythological narrative. Here, Jupiter has taken the form of a swan, which makes the image that much more disturbing. And that intimate scene takes center stage in Correggio's composition. There's even a narrative sequence here with the swan arriving at the lower right with a surprised Leda and flying away above, just next to that scene as Leda looks on. Eventually, Leda gave birth to Helen, whose abduction set off the Trojan War. It's one packed story. Leda and the Swan was a very common subject in Cinquecento painting, and we might see it today and gasp in horror, but depicting the act of making love with a swan was actually considered somehow more decent than depicting copulation between humans. So this subject reflects not only an interest in classical myth and the Metamorphoses, but also an intense interest in sex. Needless to say, these developments very much offended the papacy, which tried to stem the dissemination of publications and artworks, especially with the Counter-Reformation. But the fact that such erotic works of art and literature were produced speaks to their popularity, both among the general public and particularly among the ruling classes. And these constitute an uncomfortable but important corpus of work, because they reflect the perception of sexuality in the Renaissance. So you'll notice that many of these paintings, especially Venetian paintings, are now done on canvas rather than panel. Canvases are just woven fabrics that are made from the same material as sailcloth for boats and ships, commonly hemp. This here is a sailor's bag made from canvas. Venice was, of course, known for its naval capability and maritime trade. It was a city of boats and ships, so it makes sense that canvas as a support for painting is popularized in Venice before it spread to the rest of Italy. So canvases for Venetian paintings were oftentimes just repurposed Venetian sailcloths. Now, it had been in use in other parts of Europe and sparingly in Italy, and the advantage was that canvases could be rolled up to be shipped abroad. The disadvantage, however, was that it had a coarser texture, so painters couldn't achieve as smooth a feel as they could with panel. But especially for paintings that were made to be exported, canvas was a durable and flexible support. Now, of course, it's replaced the rather unwieldy wooden panel in modern-day painting. Mythologies weren't limited to painting. In this stunning example of Maiolica, or tin-glazed earthenware, scenes from oceanic myths decorate the sides of a pilgrim flask, a vessel originally meant for drinking water, but at this point would have been purely decorative. Here we see two Tritons, or sons of Poseidon, the god of the sea, fighting one another with a trident beside what looks like a hippocampus, a mythological seahorse. Often scenes from classical myth were commissioned to demonstrate the owner's intellect and social status, and these decorative arts especially would have been for showing off. It was also a challenging genre for artists. It required a lot of them because they had to imagine what unfamiliar mythical figures could have looked like, often deriving it from Ovid's descriptions. Religious artwork did require a similar form of imagination, but there was such an enormous body of precedent in depicting, for instance, Mary and Christ. Mythologies required artists to be original in interpretation and visualization. Titian's mature masterpiece was also a series of mythologies, but this time for Philip II, King of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. They were all completed in Venice and delivered to Toledo, the old capital, near modern Madrid. And Titian himself called these works the poesie, or painted poetry. After all, their subject matter was also drawn from the Metamorphoses, and they're truly testament to Titian's gift for visual storytelling. Several, like this one, feature Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, associated with purity and virginity. Here, she's returned from the hunt, and she's bathing with her nymphs, the spirits of the forest. But one, as she's unpleasantly discovered, is hiding something. Something that was considered a terrible secret in a group of chaste virgin maidens. That unfortunate lady is Callisto, who's pregnant. She was seduced by Jupiter, the mighty king of the gods, and a very mischievous king, too, who impregnated her. Diana knew something to be off, and she ordered Callisto to be stripped as the story went, and we can see Callisto almost fainting, swooning, while supported and stripped by the other nymphs on the left half of the composition. Titian's depicting the moment when her secret gets out, and Diana is enraged, pointing at her pregnant belly in shock. The chaste purity of the group has thus been corrupted, and Callisto is banished from the group, never to return. In the pendant piece to Diana and Callisto, visually connected by the stream in the foreground, we see another episode from Diana's misadventures. She's bathing with her nymphs once more when she's unpleasantly startled once again by the arrival of an intruder. Her nymphs have been discovered nude by Actaeon, a hunter who's inadvertently found their hideout. And instinctively we see all the women just scrambling to cover themselves up. Some look at Diana, almost waiting for her to take action. Ovid writes of this scene. While the nymphs bathed Diana in their streams, Actaeon, wandering through the unknown woods, entered the precincts of that sacred grove. With steps uncertain, wandered he as fate directed. As he entered where the clear springs welled or trickled from the grotto's walls, the nymphs, now ready for the bath, beheld the man. As we see here, Actaeon stops in his tracks, attempting to grasp what he's just done, the gravity of the incident, surprised by his indecent discovery, having ignorantly thrust the curtain to the side. And these ladies are not going to forgive him for his unwelcome intrusion, regardless of whether it was accidental. Actaeon has made a mistake. A mistake that will prove to be fatal. Ovid continues, "Oh, how Diana wished her arrows were at hand, but only having water, this she took and dashed it on his manly countenance, and sprinkled with the avenging stream his hair, and said these words, presage of future woe, Go tell it if your tongue can tell the tale, your bold eyes saw me stripped of all my robes." The skull of an antlered deer on the column behind the nymphs hints at Actaeon's eventual fate. For Diana's revenge had just begun. Ovid writes of his metamorphosis, "Diana made his ears sharp at the top. She changed his hands and feet, made long legs of his arms, and covered him with dappled hair. His courage turned to fear. He saw his horns reflected in a stream and would have said, 'Ah, wretched me!' But now he had no voice, and he could only groan. Large tears ran trickling down his face, transformed in every feature. Fear made him hesitate to trust the woods, and shame deterred him from his homeward way." In this later painting, Actaeon has wandered hopelessly deep into the forest, now in his stag form, and Diana is still watching, her anger and hatred unwavering, her determination to end him unyielding. She's a goddess known for her chastity. How could she let herself lose such dignity? And so, Titian depicts her in pursuit. For reasons unknown, this work was never sent to Philip II. It remained in Titian's Venetian studio until his death. So we think that it dates from much later in his career, and you can see his evolution toward a much more broad and free application of paint. He uses expressive invisible strokes that we term to be painterly. Titian is much more easygoing here with the exact details. Diana's bow, for example, lacks a string. It only has the wooden part. And he focuses on capturing the sense of movement. He clearly conveys Diana's intention. And he makes it clear that Diana in the foreground would win. Actaeon in the background falls. His own pack of hounds, once his dear companions, now pounce on him, thinking that he's prey. And of course, they haven't been fed. This is the time for them to feast. Ovid narrates this last scene as follows. "The whole pack fastened on their master's flesh till place was none for the others. Groaning, Actaeon made frightful sounds that not the human voice could utter, nor the stag, and filled the hills with dismal moans. And as a suppliant, fell down to the ground upon his trembling knees, and turned his stricken eyes on his own dogs, entreating them to spare him from their fangs. But his companions, witless of his plight, urged on the swift pack with their hunting cries. 'Tis said, Diana's fury raged with none abatement, till the torn flesh ceased to live." Diana's revenge is ultimately successful. So I hope you see that mythology became the high-end genre. It was seen as a hallmark of knowledge, erudition, and good taste. But those were largely for private viewing. Indeed, the common person wouldn't be able to understand those mythologies at all. That was why it was indicative of high social status. So the appreciation of mythologies was largely limited to the elitist circles of nobles and royals. But royals were also interested in crafting public images, public identities to assert their dominance not among a select group of royals and nobles, but among entire populations, among their people. And those images, those public identities, were crafted through portraiture. For patrons who weren't in the very insulated elite circles of Europe, portraiture then served a very different purpose for memorialization and commemoration. So we'll look at both noble portraiture and more bourgeois portraiture in this next segment. Among the most celebrated late 16th century artists in all of Europe was Sofonisba Anguissola, who was born in northern Italy, but ultimately worked as an official court painter to Philip II, the same Philip who commissioned Titian's Poesie. Here, Anguissola paints herself at her easel with the implements of her craft, with a palette, a paintbrush, and a long rod called a maul stick to support the hand holding the brush and to prevent it from smearing the paint. While visiting Rome in the 1550s, Sofonisba Anguissola gained the acquaintance of the elderly Michelangelo, with whom she corresponded and exchanged sketches. Famously, he challenged her to draw a crying boy, a subject he felt to be difficult. She took on the challenge and completed a study of a boy bitten by a lobster, much to Michelangelo's delight. Anguissola was hired to the Spanish court initially as a private artistic tutor to the queen, Elizabeth of Valois, who dabbled in painting herself. She rose through the ranks and became the artist in residence responsible for official royal portraits and diplomatic commissions, adopting the stately and dignified Spanish court style. She specialized in portraiture. While women artists were very limited in what they could paint, they weren't allowed to study the nude form, and so their work was largely confined to portraiture. It was virtually impossible to paint mythological or large-scale religious pictures that called for nudity, and especially male nudity. Anguissola's portrait of Philip II had for years been misattributed to one of her male colleagues at the court, a very common disservice to women artists. It shows the king in rich black silk robes with a white lace collar, attentively looking toward us. And black was actually a very expensive, that rich black, and so black textiles were quite expensive generally. And that assertive stance serves to tell us very clearly that he is the one in power here. A power dynamic has thus been established between sitter and viewer. It's just a very straightforward depiction of an authority, of a figure of authority who's commanding our respect and deference. And this was the type of royal image that was in vogue at the Spanish court. A simple and straightforward statement of authority. Art history is dominated by male artists as a consequence of the separate spheres ideology and the continuing phenomenon of discrimination on the basis of sex. Women in the Renaissance were relegated to performing domestic duties, really as men saw fit. They were wives and mothers, subject to the wants and needs of patriarchal society, which is sadly more of a continuity in history than anything else. In Italy, the publication of the Book of the Courtier was a turning point insofar as it advocated for women to be trained in the arts and humanities, which helped to change mindsets to an extent. More women began attending universities and receiving humanist educations, and so European women artists began gaining prominence in the 16th century. But it still overwhelmingly required them to be an artist's daughter, because apprenticeship involved living with the master from a very young age, would have been which would have been considered inappropriate for a girl and an older man. That would begin to change with the establishment of academies, formal schools of painting that eventually superseded the apprenticeship system. In any event, Sofonisba Anguissola's success at the Spanish court was inspirational for many later women artists. So 16th century portraitists were no longer interested in simply capturing the essence of an individual, but rather in establishing a powerful sense of physical presence, as was required of them by royal patrons like Philip II. Raphael, an incredibly accomplished portraitist, was determined to portray his subjects with a new sense of realism, and his portrait of Baldassare Castiglione conveyed such an intense sense of presence that Castiglione's wife and children actually considered it a stand-in for him in his absence. It became a body double. It was a face to whom they talked as if he was really there. Titian's Venetian portraits combine Raphael's realism with Giorgione's signature enigmatic atmosphere. Here, he's separated us from the sitter, a man in a quilted, sleeved sweater with a parapet, a stone ledge. So we don't necessarily feel that close to him, but meanwhile Titian has led him to place his arm directly over that trompe-l'oeil parapet. We're attracted to his curious, searching gaze. We're unsure of how we should position ourselves in this space. He's spatially separated, but yet so close. And this effective composition was later quoted by the 17th century Dutch artist Rembrandt, probably the most famous Dutch Golden Age painter, in his own self-portrait. In Florence, Pontormo and Bronzino, both particularly versatile portraitists, documented the rise of the Medici duchy and satisfied their demanding courtly tastes with propagandistic portraits like these. So the portrait really became a work of art with many functions. And up until now, we've been looking at half-lengths, portraits that cut off at the chest or the torso, but the full-length portrait achieves a very different effect. It establishes, I think, a much more monumental and even intimidating presence. Often these were meant to be viewed from below, instantly making the sitter appear more imperious. Here, a man takes center stage by himself. It's by Moretto da Brescia, who took his name from a town east of Milan, and the influence of Titian and the late Giorgione is evident in both the landscape and the attention to lighting. Our man stands on a marble pedestal dated 1526 in Roman numerals. He stares off into the distance with a pensive expression, perhaps at somebody else, at a lost pendant portrait, or simply in contemplation of this beautiful Lombard countryside. Oftentimes, such portraits would be hung in countryside villas. Loosely hanging over the man's left shoulder is a fashionable brocade cloak made of silk fabric with additional ornamental threads woven on top. Here we can see pale silver decorative patterning. They often feature in portraits of the nobility from this period. He wears a black sleeveless vest called a jerkin over a doublet displaying white slashes, which were quite popular. We saw smaller variations of that slash patterning in Titian's portrait, actually. In his ungloved hand, he holds a rapier, a weapon for dueling, which were actually quite common to see being carried around by everyday citizens. Kind of intimidating. And we also see a codpiece to accentuate the appearance of the genitalia. That was commonly worn to emphasize virility and masculinity, as we've seen in portraits of Henry VIII. But most conspicuous, I think, is his headdress, which is adorned by a roundel featuring Saint Christopher, who became the patron saint of travelers after helping a child cross a river by carrying him on his shoulder. And that leads us to think that this man, too, is a traveler seeking the saint's protection. We know he's a noble of good standing because there were sumptuary laws, that is, legislation restricting what you could wear and even buy to reinforce class distinctions. It was a means of reinforcing patriarchy and social hierarchy. The items that this man wears are probably the most luxurious that nobles who weren't from the ruling class were allowed to wear. In this sense, portraiture is often the best primary source for studying the history of fashion and social perceptions of gender and class. In this ostensibly simple portrait, Moretto has given us so much of that information. Lorenzo Lotto, who worked in northern Italian provincial cities like Bergamo, was a portraitist who further experimented with the visual engagement between sitter and viewer. Here he presents us with a woman who looks directly at us and confidently challenges us to consider the drawing to which she points. That drawing shows Lucretia, a Roman woman who took her own life after being raped by a statesman. So we're left to ponder the implications. Is she suggesting Lucretia to be a heroine? Suicide certainly wasn't encouraged in this period, but Lucretia's rejection of the statesman's advances was seen as an honorable act of chastity. That little wrinkled paper on the table, called a cartellino, almost like a caption, reads, "Nor henceforth shall any unchaste woman continue to live by citing the precedent of Lucretia." And those are said to be Lucretia's own final words. It means that Lucretia cannot bear to live with the shame, and that if she did, women could justify unchaste behavior using her as an example. So she committed suicide as a model of virtue for other women, an exemplum virtutis. Now, modern perceptions may differ, but Lucretia's death was certainly viewed as being heroic, as a heroic martyrdom, in fact, during Lotto's time. So our sitter is perhaps referencing Lucretia as an exemplum virtutis, and that suggests that this may be a marriage portrait, maybe a betrothal portrait. Her position is very assertive, notable because Baldassare Castiglione specifically discourages assertiveness in women in his book of the Courtier. And her confident gaze is a clear sign that she will not allow herself to be exploited. Giovanni Battista Moroni, like Lorenzo Lotto, is another underappreciated and underrated 16th century portraitist. He was a pupil of Moretto da Brescia. He's most remembered for this rare and candid depiction of a bourgeois artisan, a middle-class worker. He invites us to approach this tailor who's at his work, holding these large scissors in one hand and about to cut the fabric in the other. The tailor seems less than enthusiastic about our presence, maybe a bit disgruntled by our interrupting him. Look at those catchlights in his eye, that beautiful reflection, and the twists and turns of his high collar, the highlights on each button of his doublet. He wears breeches that are inflated around the thigh, called bombast hoses, quite fashionable for the period. And for a split second, at least for me, if you immerse yourself into the portrait to a certain depth, you can see him there in front of you, looking at you. Moroni's depiction draws you in. And Moroni was actually a pretty heavily criticized artist over the centuries, due to his supposed lack of creativity in painting his sitters, his total adherence to reality. And he indeed achieves such a level of photographic realism that we might as well be looking at a color photograph. But we have to be careful here in applying that judgment, because we cannot apply modern standards to a Renaissance painting. Nowadays, when you miss your significant other, or when you're homesick, whenever you long to be with your loved ones, you can simply tap a few buttons on a screen, and they will appear in front of you, either as a still photograph or as a live person on video. But in the Renaissance, the only way to pull up that photo was to look at a portrait of that individual. And in that moment of longing, without our modern capabilities, think about how much it would mean to be able to gaze at a painting on the wall and have that lifelike figure gaze back at you, candidly, photorealistically. And that is the key to understanding why Moroni's pictures were so highly coveted during his lifetime. Countryside villas were the rustic residences of the northern Italian aristocracy, and they provide us with interesting case studies on what patrons looked for in a residence and in home decor. Villas often adjoined farms and vineyards, which became an important source of income for merchants whose commercial livelihoods were disrupted by territorial disputes and increasing commercial competition further east. Andrea Palladio was the leading architect in 16th century northern Italy and well known for the villas that he designed, including this one northwest of Venice, the Villa Barbaro. It was constructed for the Venetian ambassador to the English court, and on the outside it looks rather like a typical Roman temple, but what's remarkable are the frescoes on the inside, commissioned by the Barbaro family. They're the work of a leading Venetian master who was a contemporary of Titian, Paolo Veronese, who took his name from the nearby city of Verona. And although Veronese's oeuvre still very much reflects the Venetian emphasis on color and lighting, he took the progressive approach of incorporating the symbolism and sophistication of late Mannerism. Veronese decorated the walls with these incredible illusionistic architectural elements. Trompe-l'oeil, balustrades and columns, and magnificent archways opening to Roman ruins. He even creates the illusion of receding space just before the balustrade railing there. Then, of course, there are these actual triangular pediments on top of the doorways that physically project out toward us. And that's Palladio's architectural design, but Veronese's frescoes complement and interact with the architecture perfectly. We see niches with musicians and faux marble flanking the doorway to the right there. But if you look closely, that doorway is actually a seamless integration of Palladio's architecture and Veronese's painting. There's a little girl who's just curiously opened this door and she's peeking in as if calling for somebody. On the other side of the room, there's a similar setup with another man who looks like he's looking for somebody, and he's the page of the Barbaro family. It's an absolutely ingenious design. The other rooms in the villa are also punctuated with trompe-l'oeil designs. And Veronese's also painted allegorical and mythological scenes. On the ceiling of the room called the Hall of Olympus, for example, he's included an array of gods and goddesses. Here he's showing off his virtuosity again in creating a receding semicircular space with a view out toward a port. The family dog is also here, relaxing under two magnificent classical sculptures comfortably nestled in niches between Ionic columns. It's such a good example of classicizing architecture, except it's painted, and very convincingly, too. So classical villas with classicizing decorations, and especially mythologies, were really the ultimate show of wealth, status, and education level. For non-ruling class nobles, this was the pinnacle of their artistic patronage. Now, for the ruling class, many of whom already lived in opulent palaces, their interests lay more in grand, imposing works by celebrated artists like Philip and Titian, or exotic decorative arts, as we'll see next chapter. And many times, they also had political motivations or propagandistic functions. Some ruling class patrons were guided by an intellectual curiosity retained from that of the High Renaissance, paired with the existing artistic exaggeration and sophistication of the Mannerist tradition, especially in the place where it originated, Florence. There, Cosimo I had been promoted to the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany by the Pope, and having realized the 13th century Florentine dream of Tuscan hegemony with the conquest of Siena. But on a bigger scale, the mannerism so strongly associated with the Medici monarchy was fading away on the Italian peninsula, driven not by a lack of popularity, but by the Counter-Reformation, which promoted a more rigid and serious approach to religious subjects. Now, to make my point, I'm going to show you another Venetian work. In religious spaces, the Mannerist approach simply didn't align with Counter-Reformation reforms aiming to promote didactic art, or art meant to teach about or inspire faith. The church wanted to get away from the idea that they were corrupt and obsessed with material wealth and pleasure, and the extravagant splendor of late Mannerism simply didn't help. So, to give you an example, I'm showing another work by Veronese. It's a massive mural with a magnificent classicizing architectural setting, and he's depicting the same instant as Leonardo did in his famous fresco. But Veronese's treatment couldn't be more different. It's a chaotic and asymmetrical composition, unlike Leonardo's. And there are many more people than just Christ's apostles here. There's a dog. There are servers and food, but also weapons. And apparently, as confessed by Veronese, if you look closely at the lower right, there are 2 drunk Germans in the corner. So it's definitely much more than the Last Supper. And the Last Supper is supposed to be a very dignified and serious biblical subject. And that right there was the issue for church officials. How could German alcoholics from a Protestant land, a heretical land, be present? How did they have any place in that holy setting, they thought. So Veronese was called to trial. He had to testify before the Holy Tribunal, the religious court. And in his response to the line of questioning, he admitted that the inclusion of these elements were his own choice. He says, "When inside a painting I still have space, I embellish it with figures invented by myself." And I think he's referring to that dog in the front there, very conspicuous, which officials thought was most inappropriate. And certainly also those German soldiers with the halberd at the lower right. He also famously says painters take the same poetic license that poets and madmen take. Now, to avoid litigation, this was a very serious offense, Veronese quickly changed not the unfitting features of the painting, but the name. Instead of the Last Supper, he called it the Feast in the House of Levi, which is still a biblical event, but a much more minor one that didn't require the serious treatment that a Last Supper would have called for. And we still know it as such today. So in late 16th century Italy, the last stronghold of the Mannerist tradition was really only Florence, where it originated under the Medici, who used artwork increasingly as political weapons and diplomatic tools. So we've already seen efforts by the Medici to legitimize and assert their authority through the use of portraiture. But one of the most unexpected attempts by the Medici to assert their dominance was actually in the imitation of Chinese porcelain, which at this time was greatly admired by the Europeans. Nobody knew how the blue and white porcelains were produced, so everybody was trying to figure out the production secret to be able to make porcelain in Europe. Earlier in the Renaissance, Florence had mastered the art of silk weaving and textile production, and that became a whole industry, supplying textiles all over Europe, and it was a huge boost of the Florentine economy. And so Florence tried again with porcelain, trying to emulate Chinese porcelains like this one from the Ming Dynasty. So this is a ewer, a vessel for holding water that was exported to Europe. And this is a Medici attempt to imitate those classic cobalt blue designs, but with a European twist. It's a pilgrim flask, a decorative vessel popular in Italy. We saw one with a mythological theme earlier. But when you compare the Medici flask to the Ming Dynasty ewer, there is still a difference. The contrast between the cobalt blue and the white isn't as pronounced in the Ming example. It's more pleasing to the eye. And if you were able to feel them, you'll notice that the Medici flask is rough to the touch, while the Chinese ewer is incredibly smooth. It's because Chinese porcelain is made from special clay minerals that simply weren't available to the Florentines. So the Florentine attempt to create porcelain and make it an industry failed. It was never anywhere near commercially successful. But it did make for great diplomatic gifts. It was still good for boasting that at least we Florentines got further in the quote-unquote porcelain business than did anybody else on the continent. Meanwhile, a talented Franco-Flemish Mannerist sculptor had arrived in Florence, Jean de Boulogne, or, easier for the Italians to pronounce, Giambologna. He had apprenticed in Antwerp and studied in Rome, where he saw the great High Renaissance marbles of Michelangelo, as well as the ancient Roman Laocoon. And Giambologna wasn't interested in visualizing pre-existing narrative content. Rather, he wanted to experiment with three-dimensional form, creating a sculpture in the round that exerts different visual effects when viewed from different angles to maximize the potential of a marble statue and to advance the art of sculpture beyond simple realism. This dynamic work is typically titled The Abduction of a Sabine Woman. It's an episode from Roman mythology wherein Roman men violently abducted a group of young women called the Sabines en masse. Now, Giambologna never had this subject or any other subject in mind when carving. This was a formal experimentation, formal in the sense of relating to form. And interpreted in this context, yes, this work would show one such abduction. But what's truly remarkable about it is not Giambologna's interpretation of the subject, but rather his positioning of the figures in a dynamic and animated figura serpentinata, three hypermuscular, curvilinear forms interlocked in a spiral. It's a format that would later be reinterpreted by the great Baroque sculptor Bernini in the next century. Now, Giambologna impressed the Medici very much. They saw great potential in him, and so he had been persuaded by the Medici to stay in Florence. In fact, I believe he wasn't allowed to exit the city because the Medici would employ him to create political propaganda in the form of monumental sculptures, a continuity in Florentine patronage from the time of Michelangelo's David, whose eyes, as you'll remember, looked directly toward Rome. On a superficial level, Samson slaying a Philistine is typical of late Mannerism, interlocked animated forms in motion with palpable tension. It shows Samson about to kill a Philistine. But on a deeper level, what it really shows is the triumph of Florence over its neighbors, especially Pisa, whose ports were key to Florentine commercial success. Florence needed access to a port out onto the Mediterranean to be able to trade. And the message here is that Florence, like Samson, emerged victorious and will always do so. Public propaganda. The final example of patronage for political purposes we'll look at is late 16th century Tudor England, where we left off a few chapters ago with the death of the young Edward VI, the sole male child of Henry VIII. And I mentioned that this led to his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, rising to power. I'm going to talk about Elizabeth I, who was born to Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, who had gotten beheaded in large part because she'd given birth to a girl. Nobody would expect that girl to actually become queen. Well, she did, and Queen Elizabeth I was called the Virgin Queen, and the Tudor dynasty actually ended with her because she never married and she never had children. Why? Well, her story can be told through her patronage, not of public or religious artwork, but of portraiture, portraits of herself. She went further than most patrons. She consciously crafted her own identity. She knew what symbols she wanted to include in her portraits, and she ordered their inclusion. And we can examine how her image was carefully designed in each portrait, and how it evolves throughout her reign. Each Elizabethan portrait is a study in the art of effective propaganda. One of the earlier official images painted of her is this very stern and intimidating likeness. It's the image of Elizabeth most people think of today when they hear her name. But here, she's interested in crafting a confident and commanding image of herself. She was an unmarried woman in the position of the Queen of England, and that just added to the existing signature Tudor paranoia. She was quite an insecure monarch. She wears a doublet, a very masculine one. It has this gorgeous gold brocade ornamentation, these puffed up or bombast sleeves, stuffed with feathers, this lace collar, and a necklace of pearls, in this case a symbol of purity, and a reminder of her virginity, of which she was quite proud. She wears a tiara, not a crown. The crown, rather, has been set aside on the table beside her, with a scepter, a staff symbolic of her power. And it's been suggested that this crown was in fact added at her request after her figure had already been painted to add something directly indicating her authority. Elizabeth holds a fixed fan with ostrich feathers, another very luxurious product. And the feathers haven't survived on this rare surviving gilt brass fan handle. Feathers were dyed and fans assembled largely on the Italian peninsula in port cities like Venice and Genoa, which had access to both ostrich feathers from Africa and oriental fans, from which they derived inspiration. Like Florentine and Lucchese textiles, these fans became introduced to various European courts, where they again became greatly valued and their use restricted by sumptuary laws to the highest classes. Well, the Darnley Portrait was painted by an unknown artist, presumably invited to her court very early on in her reign. English artists were not regarded very highly in society, and they also didn't have as long-standing of traditions to refer to as other European artists. This portrait is done in the alla prima, or wet-on-wet oil technique, in which new layers of paint are applied when the previous layer hadn't yet dried, to create even more nuance in the texture and sheen of the product. And it's for this reason, and also their attention to detail and symbolism, that Netherlandish artists were regularly employed at the Elizabethan court. Already the Darnley Portrait contains references to Elizabeth's wealth, authority, and chastity, legitimizing her claim to the throne. But later portraits would contain a much deeper and more sophisticated level of symbolism, reminiscent of the increasing intellectual sophistication of Italian Mannerist works during the mid-16th century. The Sieve Portrait is one of the most emblematic depictions of Elizabeth, specifically emphasizing her virginity, emphasizing it proudly as a declaratory message, a clear indication of her continued overt refusal to marry. The reason for that refusal was twofold. Elizabeth had made clear from the beginning of her reign that she was already married in a sense to the Kingdom of England, that this was already a full-time relationship, and so she had no time nor interest for a second one. Really, though, it was a fear of losing control of the external influence that a marriage to a foreign royal would potentially bring to England, as had been the case with her predecessor Mary I when she married Philip II of Spain. She didn't want that. She wanted to remain in power herself and retain 100% authority. And Elizabeth's resistance to the prospect of marriage was seen by many contemporaries as a sign of restraint and temperance, as evidence that she didn't fall victim to seduction, that she was never hit by Cupid's arrow. Indeed, she seemed immune to it. She had many suitors, after all. This portrait is by Quintin Matsaes the Younger, the grandson of the Quintin Matsaes responsible for the Ugly Duchess. Matsaes is yet another Netherlandish artist, so again we see a preference for their attention to detail and their incorporation of symbolism. Elizabeth, in this example, holds a sieve. It's a reference to one of the Roman goddesses, a virgin goddess, the Vestal Virgin Tuccia, who's said to have proven her virginity when carrying water on a sieve, which water can clearly flow through, without spilling a single drop. Elizabeth still has her pearls, she's dressed in black, again expensive garments, and with a white ruff collar made of lace around her neck. Black was also a color associated with dignity and stability, so she's really molding, shaping her image, dictating how she wants to be seen in the public eye. In 1586, there was a plot orchestrated by Mary Queen of Scots and her Catholic supporters to assassinate the Protestant Elizabeth, but it was discovered. What it proved was that there were very physical and very real threats to Elizabeth's power. In 1588 came another challenge. Philip II of Spain had sent troops into the English Channel, a fleet called the Spanish Armada, with the hope of invading England and ousting Elizabeth while promoting Spanish hegemony in the New World. But he underestimated Elizabeth because such was her desire to remain in power that Elizabeth had grown the naval forces and improved military responses in anticipation of attacks like this. And she would defeat the Spanish Armada in a key victory, a great source of pride for Elizabeth. And this victory is memorialized in the background of this portrait. Elizabeth confidently lays her hand on a globe rotated to show the Americas, suggesting that England was a competent and competitive player on the world stage, soon to be an imperialist power colonizing the Americas. The pearls she wears may have actually been owned by Mary Queen of Scots, who'd now been executed. What the Armada portrait betrays is Elizabeth's unquenchable thirst for power, not only over England, but over overseas dominions. She would soon send Sir Walter Raleigh to colonize the Americas. He would establish the lost colony of Roanoke in competition with other European powers, such as Spain. She's really plotting world domination. Marcus Herarts the Younger was a Netherlandish artist hired to England toward the end of the Elizabethan era. In his portrait of Sir Francis Drake, we see the explorer standing proudly next to a globe. Around his waist, Drake wears a locket given to him by Elizabeth in celebration of that grand achievement, that circumnavigation. It's called the Drake Jewel, now in the V&A, and on it there's a cameo, a profile portrait inlay featuring a black man and a white man together. It points us to the legacy of the slave trade, to the subjugation of native peoples by competing imperialist powers hungry for the riches and resources of the New World, the ranks of whom England had just joined under Elizabeth. What that also tells us is that lockets were popular items, often featuring a portrait miniature when opened. This locket, with a profile portrait of Elizabeth, was made for a noble in her circle, and it exemplifies the kind of admiration her courtiers had for her, especially with regard to English military success. You can see there an image of a ship sailing on very turbulent seas, an allusion, of course, to Elizabeth steering England through turbulent times. And on the inside, there's a Tudor rose, with a portrait miniature by the most talented English artist working in this genre, Nicholas Hilliard. The Rainbow Portrait by Herarts the Younger constitutes the culmination of Elizabethan portraiture. In many ways, this likeness features a summation of the symbolism and political messaging in previous likenesses. It's the ultimate image, the ultimate identity that she's crafted of herself. Elizabeth doesn't let us determine what to value, how we see her. How much of her do we see? She tells us. Elizabeth here would have been in her 60s, almost 70 years old, but she looks as if she's aged in reverse, like she's about to attend a very extravagant ball with all that lace supported by wire and that jewelry. There's the Serpent of Wisdom on the sleeves of her sumptuous orange cloak. She's deifying herself. She looks almost to me like a fairy. It's absolutely exquisite, the rendering of all those details. She carries in her right hand a rainbow, which lends the portrait its name. And the inscription just above it reads, "No rainbow without the sun." So it's symbolic of peace, especially peace after turmoil, returning to the image of the ship on the Heneage jewel, suggesting once again the stability that she's brought to England. Indeed, in this portrait, Elizabeth embodies peace. But look closely at her beautiful orange robes, and you see an unsettling program of ornamentation. While her bodice is adorned with fresh flowers, elsewhere we see an assemblage of eyes and ears. And you don't need much explanation to deduce what that implies. I see you and I hear you. She's speaking to England. Part of her paranoia involved implementing a sophisticated espionage network. She had a spy master orchestrating these efforts, warning her of any threats to her reign, keeping an eye out for dissenters. It was like the Elizabethan version of MI5. Here the message is clear. Be careful what you say or do. It's all under Elizabeth's radar, under her control. Ostensibly. But this portrait seems to say, unquestionably. This is the power of an image to sway, to deceive, to influence, and to convince. Analyzing propaganda is more important than ever in the age of digital information and disinformation. And by looking at historically successful uses of propaganda and the motivations of their patrons in commissioning them, we can gain new insight into the power of images and the power of art. In the final chapter of this series, we'll examine the characteristics of the early Baroque style and follow up on developments all across Europe around the year 1600, including a discussion of the cabinets of curiosities so popular in royal circles. And as the curtains of the Renaissance draw to a close, we'll summarize the highlights of this period at the macro level and reconsider the field of art history at large.